Hello. Hi. So I like to start right on time. I'm very much in touch with my inner German. I don't know if I have any German heritage. But so I'm going to talk about learn the various branches of astrology and astrological schools. And I have an agenda. I also would say that those of you who are in the back, maybe you might want to come to the front because I would say that I have, this is an information-packed presentation. And I'm not going to read everything that's on the slides. So if you want to screenshot it, if you're paying attention or looking at it from Zoom or here, feel free to do so. But just so you know, I'm gonna just more encapsulate particular things rather than try to describe and read everything as I kind of put it on the slide. But this is what we're going to cover today, as you can see why this topic, and I'll go through. And I'll start with why this topic. And this is probably the most beginner-oriented topic that I've presented here at NORWAC. There's lots of confusion, especially from newbies and even seasoned astrologers, on the lack of distinction between a form of astrology, a technique, and shared branches. That a lot of people don't know what's a branch from, like they'll say like, well, I'm a sidereal astrologer, and I don't think that's an actual branch of astrology. So I'm going to clarify my understanding of what is the distinction between the various forms, techniques, and branches of astrology and schools of astrology. And again, I'm just using more my 30+ years of study and work. I do not think of myself as the definitive authority on this matter. I've just done my own set of research. I'm just gonna do something real quick. Oh, he's gonna do something. Oh, that's interesting. But yeah, I don't consider myself the definitive authority on this, but I do, and I would say, nor do I see that this is completely exhaustive, like we're gonna do everything there, but it's more so just to kind of give you some sense of how we might start thinking about this particular topic. All right, but while you're doing it. Just want to make sure you can see the captions in the back. Okay. Also, speaking of the captions, which is what Aaron was just talking about, when I go toward the last part of the slide, I will read that just to make sure that everyone on Zoom and then also here know what I'm talking about. All right. Let me know when it's. Okay. All right, cool. All right, so again, it says at the bottom, not meant to be an exhaustive talk or completely covering everything. Uh-oh. Reset with the mouse, right? There we go. There you go. Meet some of the schools, systems, forms, styles of astrology. So one of the things I want to say, and if you attend or you actually know Ali Alomi's talks or his Patreon, one of the things I really like that he has to say that I really do find myself aligned with, because there's a natural question where we might say, as we're talking about these various forms or schools of thoughts of astrology, they're just all Western. I'm just going to challenge that very briefly, and I would say the better term for them would be Afro-Asiatic. And like, what do you mean by why are they Afro-Asiatic? Well, lest we forget, Egypt is in Africa. And I just want to emphasize that, because I think that's often forgotten when astrologers get together and they'll talk about Alexandria and they'll talk about Hellenistic astrology, not recognizing that it has African origins. That's not just about Blackness, it's not just about race, it is about the place where it originates. Asiatic, that can be quote unquote questionable, because one thing that's fascinating to me, Turkey is considered, more part of Asia, but almost as narrow as the passage between Manhattan and Brooklyn is that, Greece is right there. So why that's suddenly, well, that's part of Europe, Sam, and not part of Asia, that's also an interesting question. That's more about geography. So I just want to give you the more broader sense of understanding these general things. Now, I'm going to make a distinction. I'm not sold on my analogy. Again, like I said, I'm not going to read everything that's on this slide, but there is a question: what constitutes a school? And I'll give you just the first sentences related to them. A school reflects a historical and philosophical milieu of astrology. It may not always be homogeneous, but there are many shared principles in other parts of it. A branch of astrology is more about a set of practices centered around a particular set of topics or outcomes. One analogy I'm working with is that you might be enrolled, if you're at a university, you could be in a particular college or college of like liberal arts. And then a branch would be like, well, what's your major, right? And so that would give you some measure of specialization. So we could say about psychology. And then when we're talking about technique, that would be more a qualitative study of like neuroses using interviews, because that's going to be more about your methods. So technique, method, approach is more about tools, processes, or coordinated emphases that direct how astrologers address astrological topics or issues. So I'm going to cover each of these in the allotted 75 minutes that I have, but I want to give you the broad spectrum of understanding the distinction. So we could say, starting with this, these reflect certain schools of thought, and I've divided them up into classical, modern, and new age, okay? And again, I'm owning these as fully arbitrary, and what I've kind of designated them, so I'm not trying to say that, again, with any level of definitive authority that this is how it should be, but I am dividing it more by some measure of time, but also some measure of where they direct their focus and attention. So classical, we can start with Babylonian. And what I would recommend, especially related to these slides, since they're so information rich, is I actually have divided them into two things. One, for you to understand the period of history in which we're talking about it. And then I've broken down some key texts so that if you take a screenshot or if you do a photo, you can look up these sources. Now, let me be clear, because I know I'm speaking to some millennials, Gen Z, other folks. The question I asked myself as I was doing this, well, why aren't you referencing particular YouTubes or things online? Let me just say this, and I am actually Gen X. And if you want to say like, you just sound old, that's fine. I like books. And I think people should read more books. Now, if you feel shamed, I'm sorry, that's on you. And I'm not saying that you can't do YouTube and you can't do these other things, but books largely, we hope, have been edited, referenced, fact-checked. And so what you'll see pretty much throughout this whole presentation are books. So just so you can reference them and have details. So Babylonian is where we might start among the earliest period. Now, I do want to say this. It's what we have found recorded earliest. I am not saying that maybe astrology didn't begin elsewhere. Some people like to say, well, it began in South Africa. I don't know that. It could have. But in terms of documentation, this is what we have. And here are some of the elements that I want to stand out, because I told you I'm not going to read everything. What's interesting is that the Babylonians were the first to introduce the idea of the sexagesimal system, which is measured in units of 60, where we get like 60 minutes, all those particular things. Also, they went from initially 18 signs related to their zodiac and pared it down to 12. One theme I want to say is that it was mainly for royalty, so it was curated by priests, so that's what you're seeing at the bottom. And it was considered an astral religion. They didn't make such a clear distinction between planets as gods and representing or even being the gods. So that's important to kind of be able to take in, rather than just thinking like, oh, they disputed as we did. And they were the first, as we've been able to document, to use 5 visible planets and 2 luminaries. Egyptian, and also known as Kemetic, So the Kemetic, where did that name come from? That's literally what the Egyptians called themselves. They called themselves Kemites, and they called their land Chem. So among the things that we know about, and I'm going to reference some key things, and you can also see on the right-hand side key texts that I would recommend. And the period is from 2100 BCE to 1st century BCE in terms of or CE, sorry, as far as we can document. They used 36 asterisms, which we now know as the decans. And so this becomes the basis for how we understand even the concept of the horoscope, the hour marker. So it's the horoscopus, and they would actually, during each of their weeks, which were 10 days, not 7 days, they would observe, especially at night, along with particular rituals, how these particular decans would rise, and they were asterism star clusters related to particular gods, how they would rise in the sky. So that becomes the basis for what we understand as decans. The other part of it is that they were very much into observing the sun, what they believed to be the sun's own star, which we call Sirius, but they knew it as Sotpet. And so their year was designated by the inundation of the Nile along their basin because they depended on the Nile. And also that was the beginning of their year. That was their new year. Now that becomes important for a couple things that I'll get to in the next slide. Among the other things that we have in terms of crediting the Egyptians or the Kemites is that they observed and had high reverence for the sun. So the sun coming above the horizon in the morning signaled it's kind of bringing the idea of life. And then as it would descend into the west, it was believed to go into the underworld and go into the world of the dead. And so the pharaohs were buried on the western side of the Nile, and then they were observing, the sun's rise in the eastern. This is why we will see that we have the ascendant on the left-hand side of the chart, and it's rising, and then we have the south more toward the top of the chart. And again, that's interesting because the Nile is one of the, there are a lot of rivers that flow from north to south, but it's one of the few, it's not, there's more than just one or two, but among the few or several rivers that flow from south to north. So it comes from the interior of Africa all the way more toward the north. And it was largely for the pharaohs and organized by the priests, which is the similarity that it has to the Babylonians. It wasn't so much just predictive as much as thinking about particular rituals, and it was instructive for the kind of pharaoh the pharaoh would be and for magic. So I mentioned in the previous slide just you saw that Sotpet and the observation for the inundation of the Nile or the inundation of Egypt was during what we now would call the period of Cancer. And so if you want to look at the basis of this chart, which is called the Thema Mundi, it is observing starting with Cancer rising. That is directly from Egypt and Alexandria. So that's where we kind of can credit that. So the moon was given to Cancer and the sun was given to Leo, but technically, the sun as a quote unquote masculine principle and the key giver of life actually had domain over all the signs of the zodiac, but they were just parceled to the other signs, the other planets, as their places of domains, almost like how we talk about dukes and duchesses and lords and ladies. So, and I won't go too deep into the mysteries of this particular chart, but that's the basis of it. And then when I mentioned the decans, where you divide each sign into 10 for a total of 30 degrees, which means 3 decans per sign. This is where we have this from Hellenistic astrology. And again, I just want to point out, yeah, my cursor is shown, is that, if you start from Cancer, the moon is for the first decan, and then Mercury, and then Venus. Actually, it's reverse. Venus, Mercury, and then the moon, and then we go on. So this is in honor of the actual tradition of the decans from Egypt. This is from the Temple of Dendera, which also observes the decans, which are more along the outer realm of it. And then we have what you might recognize, because people will recognize like the Scorpion, the Sag, Capricorn, all the way around the 12 signs. And then there's more of the other inner gods that are observed during these particular points. Now, a lot of people see this, and I need to make a historical correction. When I say historical correction, a lot of people come up with their own ideas related to this. The Temple of Dendera is dated in the what's called the Ptolemaic era. Now, that means it was a confluence of influence from Greece, from Mesopotamia, from Babylon. And so it wasn't just that the Greeks, well, you know, it's clearly that the Egyptians created the zodiac. They did a fusion, and I'm going to talk about that in the very next slide. There was a fusion that happened, but the basis for how we have the horoscope, the decans, the orientation of a chart, all of that is more indigenous to ancient Egypt. But we do find a synchronization or synthesis that happens after Alexander has, or his generals have a conquest of Egypt. So what you're seeing in that first or top part of the slide is a clear understanding that in the 1st century up until around the 7th century, we observe a synthesis of various different forms that existed in the African Asiatic world coming together. So one of the things that also happens is that astrology becomes more accessible beyond a priestly or royal class. And then there are charts that we have found for slaves, for enslaved people, for ordinary people, for farmers, all kinds of people. So it becomes much more, you know, broad-minded. We have to credit the 3 Roberts for kind of resurfacing this particular form of astrology called Hellenistic astrology from Project Hindsight. And those 3 Roberts, which are mentioned here, and you can't really see it over the closed captions, are Robert Schmidt, who has passed away, Robert Zoller, who was actually one of my initial teachers, who has passed away, and Rob Hand, who's still very much alive. And so, but we have those guys to thank. You'll see the books that are mentioned there. There are more books, but these are the ones I would recommend. And we have our own very own Demetra George with astrologies, Ancient Astrology, Volumes 1 and 2. Jyotish, also known as Vedic astrology. Now, many will say Vedic astrology, and again, this is a school, you know, the continuum of thought is a misnomer, and it should be just called what it is, which is what in Indians call it, some will call it Hindu astrology. Jyotish is a Sanskrit word for the study or the science of light. And it was transmitted by oral means for millennia before it was documented in the Vedas. So it's not just an astrology that comes from the Vedas, but more so documented in the Vedas, which are sacred and ancient Hindu scriptures. And Jyotish has an indigenous astrology that's based on the moon going through 27 or 28 asterisms. Like, what do you mean by that? Most often Vedic astrologers now use 27 asterisms called nakshatra, but there are actually, in fact, 28. They just may not always use the 28th one. They often will also use a sidereal zodiac, which is based on using a fixed star as a starting point for a zodiac. I will make one correction. You'll hear me talk about it tomorrow or Sunday when I give my keynote. It is not constellation. There is no current well-known astrology that is singularly based on the constellations. A lot of people will say, well, for sidereal astrology, well, we actually use the constellations. No, you don't actually. What actually happens is that you use a fixed star as a starting point of your zodiac, and then you just give it 30 degrees from each particular point. Many scholars believe that other features of Jyotish do come from Alexander's conquest of the region. And in fact, there's documentation for this, that it comes from the recording of a text. So we have testimony of this from the Yavana Jataka, which actually literally translates as the sayings of the Greeks. So some measure of the idea of how, you know, we have even particular words, trigon is trikona, all these particular words that are used, or even the idea of the 12 signs, that comes from what may have been introduced by the synthesis of that was happening between Mesopotamia, Babylon, and Egypt by the Greeks in Alexandria. And these are some of the books I would recommend if you were interested in studying more about Jyotish. Chinese astrology, and by the way, I hope I don't offend anyone by looking at all these different forms of astrology, and someone could say, well, why aren't you mentioning Mesoamerican or Aztec or Incan astrology? I can't do everything. That's first. And then the other reason is that it is believed that there is some elements of Chinese astrology that were influential, or there was some measure of cross-fertilization between those who, especially in the Islamicate era, which I'll get to shortly, where there was some cross-fertilization and discussion and exchange related to dimensions of the zodiac. There's one particular astrologer and historian who's also documenting this. This is Jeffrey Kotick, also kind of saying these particular things. So the reason why I selected Chinese astrology rather than other things, I don't think that was happening before the 20th century in terms of Mesoamerican astrology. So that's the only reason why it's not here. But Bazi, meaning 8 characters, that's literally what it would translate to, is looking at a heavenly earthly dyad, meaning heaven, earth, 4 characters, hence 8, based on a person's year, month, day, and hour of birth in 2 6-year cycles, which actually has some correlation, as I explained toward the middle. The 12-year cycle of animal signs, and most people think that's the only aspect of Chinese astrology. It is not. Matched with one of the 5 Chinese elements is predicated on the feminine Jupiter cycle. So there's a way in which there's a whole different mathematics that goes into understanding Bazi. And it also maintains the integrity of being a solely lunar calendrical system. And like I said, it links up the 5 elements with the 5 visible planets. All right. And then you have those books there, which I would recommend, The Complete Guide to Chinese Astrology and Calculating the Bazi. This is actually, I have to give credit where credit is due. And again, this is to Ali Alomi, where he's framed the idea of an Islamicate astrology. I do want to make a very important distinction. It does not mean it is an Islamic astrology. There's a difference. Islamicate is talking about the period where large swaths of the world, especially the old world, are under the control of Muslims or the Islamic empires, but not everyone who was contributing to astrological research and work were Muslims. Is that distinction clear? Okay, yeah, so that's important because like some of the seminal thinkers like Mashallah and Ezra, they were Jews and they were not Muslim, and some were even Christian. So what happened as the Muslims moved westward from Arabia, they became very interested in tying all aspects of knowledge to the revelation of Muhammad, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him. And so that led to some seminal developments, both in terms of translations of text and the resurfacing of knowledge that had been lost after the fall of Rome. And so there were seminal advances in calculation and observations related to the heavens, but also in terms of development of mathematics. Probably some of you know that algebra, for instance, and cryptography, all of that advanced and was developed during this Islamicate era. And so this, they were very fascinated and interested in unpacking what they could discover from Hellenistic astrologers and from the Hellenistic era and period. Abu Mashar, perhaps the most notable astrologer of this era, led the way in compiling and describing many of the techniques and ideas that form the bedrock of other astrologies to come. And so you see over there a good number of texts. At least, you know, you can also subscribe to Ali Alomi's Patreon. I don't work for the man, right? So I don't get a kickback or anything like that, but I do think he's one of the few scholars, but there's a growing number of scholars who actually has knowledge of these actual texts from their languages to be able to translate them. Because it's largely been under the patronage of Westerners who may only casually or remedially learn or know these languages. But he actually has grown up with them and has studied and also is a professor of history. but I also mentioned some other translations and texts as well. And then with medieval astrology, as the power of the Islamic Empire began to wane, we have the rise of what we now know as Europe. And so many of the Greek and Latin texts that had been translated by Islamic scholars pass on to those in Europe and becomes part of the Renaissance that we come to know related to European history. And it heralds the resurgence of Christendom, right? The idea that, you know, after the Moors or the Islamic Empire left Spain, then we have the rise of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And so a lot of different commercial and intellectual activity was recommenced and under the umbrage of Christianity. That doesn't mean that nothing was happening before, especially in like places like Spain or Italy. But we now have other folks like Guido Bonatti, Marsilio Ficino, Jean-Baptiste Morin, and William Lilly kind of advancing this particular form. Now, during this time, we also have the church, you know, punishing alternately Christians, but I mean, astrologers, but at the same time, fascinated by trying to resurface this knowledge. So astrologers were attempting to weave Neoplatonic thinking, various forms of magic and hermetica, Christian theology, along with these exciting technological and economic advances, because it's, you know, discovering new worlds, quote unquote, for them. It wasn't that, you know, if you have people there, it doesn't mean that it wasn't undiscovered or not discovered. But this was kind of an exciting period in terms of European history. So let's go into the modern era. And the modern era largely is under the province of the 20th. Now, I will be fair to say some measure of this does start to emerge in the late 19th century. But I kind of will just say, just in the interest of time, position this more from the 20th century. So psychological astrology largely is influenced by the ideas of Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. But, and this is interesting because I came to astrology in the 90s, and a lot of the books that were available were pretty much from the 80s and from the 70s. And so there were other forms of psychology too, like transactional analysis, which I think has gone the way of the dodo. I don't hear anyone talking about it, but other forms of psychology that were surfacing and astrologers were trying to integrate with those. And so there was a lot of integration, using that word, of the new planets like Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, and then the heavenly bodies as being discovered by astronomers. Planets and signs were viewed as universal archetypes, you know, like so. Was that true? Well, I mentioned that in Babylon and Egypt, they were more described as gods and related to actual personages, or spirits, as in terms of the Islamicate and medieval era. There was a greater emphasis on individual free will and an interpretation in definitive boundaries of fate, as well as exploring something called the conscious and unconscious realms of mind. This is important because I think one of the things, if you study more of the classical forms of astrology, which are also dubbed as traditional, there is no real notion of quote unquote conscious or unconscious. You know, you had a demon, or you were in touch with your jinn or your spirit, right? We might look at that through a different lens in the modern sense. There's an emphasis on the psychological state of the person, not prediction. Astrologers function more as oracles or as counselors than a storyteller, or as a storyteller, sorry. These are some of the books. Now, I'll just say this. Anything by Liz Green pretty much qualifies as psychological astrology. But there are other astrologers who I want you to take note of, including Greg Bogart, but Stephen Arroyo, even though Stephen dances a line between what now we might dub, or I will say, as evolutionary astrology, and then psychological astrology. I'm going to read just a little bit of this about humanistic astrology. There's a natural question some of you might have in Zoom land, or you might actually have here. Why did you make a distinction between psychological and humanistic? Because sometimes they are used interchangeably. There's a reason, and I like to quote Michael Meyer here, because he wrote this book, The Handbook of the Humanistic Astrologer, and I won't read the whole quote, But the humanistic person-centered approach to astrology, as its name implies, is an astrological parallel to the third force of psychology promoted by Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, and many others. Then I'll read toward the bottom. The humanistic approach to astrology sees the person as an independent, organic whole consisting of an intricate pattern of interrelated and interacting forces. One distinction, and I actually say it here, between humanistic astrologers and more hardcore, we could say, psychological astrologers may be more related to their source material. So for instance, someone like Liz Green may be more into talking about the unconscious and more influenced by Jung than we might have someone like Dane Woodyer or Michael Meyer. They may talk more about related to your human potential and not just so much about the unconscious. They're still teetering more toward the spiritual. They are more interested, humanistic astrologers, in human potential, self-discovery, and understanding their rigid predictions. What's interesting about them is that they still, unlike psychological astrologers, they do get more into prediction, but they look at it more through planetary cycles as guideposts, like your Saturn return, or looking at your synodic Mercury Sun return, or Venus return, or your Uranus opposition, those things. And if you are interested in that exploration, I would recommend to you Cycles of Becoming by Alexander Ruperti that I have up there, which he gets very much into looking at the alignment of planetary cycles for your own spiritual, psychological, and emotional development. And then there is cosmobiology, Uranian astrology. It was very important for me to put this in because one of the things I've observed in looking at the zeitgeist of people sharing things on social media, and Ebony, you can back me up because I think you're going to start a course or a class on this pretty soon. Is that true?
I have a master class.
Yeah, you're having a master class in Uranian, but you can back me up. I don't hear folks talking about Uranian astrology as much in I guess the Twitter sphere or in the social media sphere. So I really wanted to emphasize this particular one because I had to study it for my certification with NCGR. As I mentioned here, it starts with Alfred Witte, and it goes pretty much from 1925 to present. And it also then develops, because it also starts using the 8, I guess, planets, the hypothetical planets, which we've not found, but are still very useful in analysis. And then Reinhold Ebertin, he also develops more the cosmobiological part of the school. And many of his ideas, including paired with Witte's, become incorporated in modern parlance. So for instance, harmonics, astrologers will talk about solar arc direction and what's called dial work. I'll show you the dial in just a minute. The emphasis with this school is more on accurate prediction and psychological insight, with little emphasis on houses and quality of zodiac signs. Those books that you see on the right are among the other texts that you can reference. Here is an example of the 90-degree dial that you can use. And you'll see that it kind of divides the signs into cardinal, mutable, and fixed in 30-degree positions along this dial. You're like, okay, that's nice, it's cute, what do you use it for? Here's an example of using it. And I like to use it with Queen Elizabeth's chart because I've taught this with solar arcs. And what happened is that I'm looking at, on the outer wheel, you can see Saturn and the midheaven for her solar arcs, progressing her chart 1 degree for each year of her life. And what you'll see here is that the sun, by solar arc, is between Saturn and the midheaven, the MC, on February 6, 1952. And that's, again, the sun is on the inner wheel, her natal chart is on the outer wheel, but it's all in a 90-degree dial. And it's very specific. You can start finding things with a lot more specificity than just looking by the eye with a natal chart. Now, what do you think happened? She became the Queen of England. And so if you look at that sense of responsibility, Saturn midheaven, along with the sun, is a perfect symbolic measure of that. And so things are described this way, as you see on the right here, solar arc sun equals Saturn midheaven point. So it gets a lot more technical, but it has a certain level of specificity, especially if you want to talk about prediction. Harmonic vibrational astrology was advanced by John Addy in 1957, so it goes into the present. And harmonics are divisions of the 360-degree dial, or I could say the zodiac circle, aligned for the study of more subtle and nuanced planetary interactions than traditional aspects. So for instance, people are always a little baffled by this, and they're like, but, you know, how does this work? Well, you already are familiar with it. When we talk about an opposition, that's the second harmonic, because you've just divided a wheel by two. Trines are dividing it by 3, so that's 120 degrees. Squares are dividing it by 4, 90 degrees. So the idea of the harmonic can be even going to other, dimensions of dividing the circle by 11. And what do you end up with? And so looking at these various harmonics, especially when you apply it with statistical analysis, which also harmonic and vibrational astrologers do, you can start to see whether you have a certain emphasis of a certain harmonic. So I mentioned here, for instance, Aretha Franklin's chart has her Venus, Pluto, and Uranus very strong in the 11th harmonic when you divide it by 11. And you can have computers do this. I mean, I don't try to do this by hand or at home, but you can have a computer do it. And what you discover, David Cochran, who I mentioned on the right over there, reports that this is a common feature for rock stars. Bob Dylan also is very strong in the 11th harmonic. And what they found that the 11th harmonic deals with a certain need to kind of break with convention and be very different in a certain way. Okay, and so you see the list of people over there. Then bringing us into the new age, we have the Theosophical astrology, also known as astrosophy also from Rudolf Steiner. And these teachings are based on a quote-unquote ancient wisdom tradition to move forward personal and collective evolution. Steiner's astrosophy or star wisdom or Sophia is the spiritual scientific understanding of our new and enhanced relationship to the world of the stars. We also could say that much of the emphasis in astrology of concepts like karma, reincarnation, Akashic records broadly come from this school of thought, from this period of history. So when astrologers start talking about, I mentioned Abu Mashar from the Islamicate era, and they might ask, like, what did Abu Mashar think about karma in the chart? He didn't. This is new. This is something that largely comes from the late 19th century into the 20th century. So that's important to mention because a lot of people, okay, I'm gonna come out of my closet a little bit. I don't believe in reincarnation. I know I'm at an evolutionary astrology conference. I don't believe in reincarnation. Doesn't make sense to me. And what was interesting is that I mentioned something like this on Facebook, and someone was like, "Aren't you an astrologer?" And I was like, "Yeah, but it's not. It's recognizing that this is why I wanted to emphasize schools. It comes from particular schools of thought, and a lot of people don't know. They just think it's astrology, not recognizing it comes from different periods of history." Similarly, now what's funny is I have studied this form of astrology with my teacher, Alan Oken, who's mentioned on the right there. Esoteric and what's called intuitional astrology is similar to theosophical astrology, but it's largely channeled by Alice Bailey from, we're not sure if it's embodied or disembodied ascended master called Dwaj Kul. And it's less upon mundane material manifestations and outer effects and more about soul evolution and spiritual causes. So that's something to take note of, is that this is a shared reality between theosophical and intuitional or esoteric astrology. Each zodiac sign has an exoteric ruler, which is what we generally know, and an esoteric ruler with along with one or more 7 rays. So there are 7 rays that are identified by Dwaj Kul. The undiscovered body, for instance, Vulcan, is one of the esoteric rulers for Taurus, and Virgo, along with Earth, for instance, used as the esoteric ruler of Sagittarius. So it's a completely different tradition than many might know. Now, one thing that many don't know is that the popular astrology software Solar Fire is directly inspired by Alice Bailey's work. In fact, even by the name. And so it's what you actually can even use with the software itself. This is actually somewhat true with Astro Gold, because the initial developer for Solar Fire is also the developer for Astro Gold. And so there's some measure of some parallel, even though I think Astro Gold has kind of cleared that out. They don't have as much of that reference. All right, I'm not gonna read all of this, but I'm gonna tell you at least a little bit at the top. And I wanted to quote everything from Stephen Forrest's website, because, and you may or may not know this, NORAC was largely an evolutionary astrology conference. And most of the folks here were evolutionary astrologers, so I was not allowed to fuck up and not mention in detail and be clear evolutionary astrology. Okay, so I had to quote because I don't want to misrepresent anybody. So it says evolutionary astrology embraces paradigms and methodologies which specifically measure the growth of the soul from life to life. Again, reincarnation. These methods invariably focus on the planet Pluto and its relationship to the moon's nodal axis, meaning the north and south node, lunar nodes. While it is composed of a set of specific formal methodologies, evolutionary astrology is ultimately characterized less by a technical approach than by a set of philosophical principles defined by natural law. And so you see spelled out here, what are those natural laws and what they see as those key principles. Again, I'm not going to read all 7, but since this came from the key progenitors of evolutionary astrology, Stephen Forrest and Jeffrey Wolf Green, those names, and you see those books referenced on the right, and including Maurice Fernandez, even though I wouldn't call him necessarily a progenitor, that gives you a sense of what evolutionary astrology is about. There's Kabbalistic astrology. This is based on Jewish mysticism. And also there is a difference between Kabbalistic with the K and with the Q. The distinction I may say, Kabbalistic is probably much more tied to the Jewish tradition. The one with the Q is more explicitly Christian and tying in what we call Hermeticism, and largely draws on thoughts and thinkers from the 19th and 20th century. Many of these folks were theosophists or folks who fled theosophy. Much of what we now accept as orthodoxy for the tarot comes from this tradition and its syncretic connections to astrology, including major and minor arcana with planet signs and the decans. So this is important to realize, you know, when we have tarot readers talking about this is from this particular aspect of astrology. I list on the right some of the key thinkers related to this, especially in terms of books, but you also could reference the Golden Dawn, Aleister Crowley, these particular folks to give you some sense of it. Last but not least is signology, sun sign astrology. That's my own awkward phrasing for something that astrologers have done to the public and ourselves. It emphasizes the zodiac signs and the foundational understanding of planets, planetary phases, and relationships between planets and points. I give some measure of the history, starting with Richard Naylor, who actually was filling in for his mentor, Cairo, William John Warner. And he wrote on the announcement of Princess Margaret and did her horoscope. And then that led to like a bum rush for the Sunday Express of interest in astrology. And then he had his own column. We also have attempted to make signs express more than they were ever designed to express. It's the sun that expresses the badassness of the ego or what's associated with ego, not just necessarily Leo itself. For instance, I'm gonna pick on a Gemini in the room, my brother Colin, right? You know, as soon as I said Gemini, right? You knew it was you, right?
I said, oh no.
Right. So for instance, people pick on Gemini, like, hey, why are you two-faced today? Well, first it's two-faced. No, it's not, but it's more about Mercury. Mercury is the trickster. You know, just one Gemini is just some manifestation of it, but we kind of come to associate all the traits related to Mercury onto Gemini. And this is not the traditional way. Doesn't mean that we can't have, as Stormy Grace said this morning, we can't have fun with it. It can't be a conduit toward more. But I think a lot of people just think that astrology is just sun sign astrology. We also have to be careful of collapsing, and this is what it says at the end, equating separate things. So for instance, Neptune equals Pisces, which equals the 12th house, rather than seeing the distinctions between them. Okay, so that was a lot with the schools. It gets a little easier with the branches, a little easier, and that only took 45 minutes. But we have some sense of time, and I wanted to be thorough with that because it gives you some sense of history. The one thing I hope you draw from this lecture is understanding distinctions between schools, branches, and the techniques, but more important that you start to grasp that when we say astrology, in truth, we're probably talking more about various forms of astrology, or we could say astrologies. There's natal astrology, which is probably the most popular branch. Also, you could call it gynecological. It's the branch of astrology concerned with casting, interpreting birth charts. It comes from natus, which means birth. And again, I won't go too much into this because most of you are probably very familiar with the concept. It's related to Aristotle's principle of entelechy, which is the realization of potential, meaning an acorn becomes oak, in terms of the seed becomes a plant, the girl becomes a woman. So it actually was taught in, as we teach it usually first in our current form of astrology, but it usually was one of the last forms of astrology you would study. You would study horary, electional astrology, and then maybe go to mundane, but then talking about a human life that was even much more complicated. There's horary astrology, a branch of interrogational astrology, or katarke, which means katarke is looking at the beginnings of things, harking back to another idea in astrology, which I just mentioned, which is entelechy. And horary, and I like Lee Lehman's definition, horary astrology as a process of examining questions that are asked in sacred time. So there is a certain sacredness, a certain approach that you have. My horary teacher described it as the objective picture of events in the state of becoming in actuality with regard to the question or the issue posed. Key to horary is the question and what makes it sacred in terms of the moment with it. Now, astrologer William Lilly is credited as one of the most salient exemplars of this particular art. Electional astrology is related to it because it has the same similar origin, which is katarke. And I like to quote a definition from the Nauticum Astrologicum by John Gadbury, where he says, to give a definition of what constitutes an election. An election, in an astrological sense, is the serious and exact choice of a genuine and proper time, wherein we may, by God's assistance, of course, because remember, this actually comes from the medieval period where God is, you're trying not to get burned by the church, according to the energy and influence of second causes, begin or attempt any matter of business or eminent weight and consideration prosperously and to good effect. Or more concisely, it is the choosing of a good and favorable position of heaven and the shunning of a bad one in our commencement of any eminent or weighty affair relating to human life. Various schools of thought have their own varied rules on what constitutes a good election, but this is why it's a branch rather than a school. Medical astrology is more where we have various approaches that have been taken, including the melothesia, where we have each particular body part ruled by a particular sign, and that formal term is melothesia. Astrologers also use various methods to assess the health of individuals. So either to figure out how long a person might live is called the Theta or Heilig. Delineating various planets and houses, like the roles of the sun, moon, 6th, 12th houses, or the lot of fortune and the ascendant. Astrologers would also use something called temperament to understand someone's particular health, whether they would suffer particular maladies. And you might be familiar with these terms: choleric, sanguine, melancholic, or phlegmatic. We also know that there are planetary time lords and house rulers. Like if you're familiar with perfection, that would be a measure of, if you have a lord of your year, what you might be dealing with in terms of your health. Other practitioners would use interrogational astrology in two forms. One of them would be horary, fuck is wrong with me? What happened to me just now, right? That's one particular way in which you could use horary. And then the other one is where you have the decumberature chart, where you're looking at the moment you just realize that you have a health crisis, like when you wake up and you have a scratchy throat, or you have trouble getting out of bed, period. That's your decumberature chart. You can use electional astrology to select when you have an auspicious moment to perform something, to start taking medicines or treatment or even surgery. So that's how you might deal with that. Then there's synastry. The definition I like is from Greg Bogart, where he says two people who have a relationship of some kind have connections between their charts. Synastry is the art of discerning the quality of that energetic exchange. That's very important. I want to emphasize discerning, because a lot of people think it's just about the magic of the two charts coming together. And it is not, right? So if you go on your first date, our charts just match until you discover, like, he's married, right? It doesn't matter. It matters in the sense of understanding your connection, but you have to look at that in tandem with real world effects. Classical astrologers also paid attention to compatibility, but they looked at it between the luminaries and Venus between charts and along angles, meaning the ascendant, descendant, midheaven, and IC. Modern astrologers we have to thank for two innovations, one by John Townley called the composite chart, and the other one by Ronald Davison called the Davison chart. Composite charts are the midpoints between planets and points in two separate charts to create a third entity or third chart representing the relationship. So you're just looking at the midpoints between planets, midpoints between the ascendant and midheaven, and you kind of come up with more of those factors. The Davison chart sounds similar, but it is not. It is a midpoint chart between the two birth dates, literally, and the actual birth locations. So this could be a real chart, so if you and your partner are 4 years apart and almost just 2 days apart from each other, then it's gonna be the midpoint is gonna be the 2-year mark from the oldest one, and then 2 days from the middle point between your two birthdays, and then also your locations. Similarly, these tools and principles can be used to explore compatibility between multiple sets of relationships. And what I'm emphasizing there, it can be business partners, friends, your children, your parents. So I don't want to have you think it's just for relationships. Then there is this new development I mentioned during my intro when I talked about Michael Bryan, training people for a test, astrocartography, astrolocality. So early texts introduced this idea of astrolocality, but it was more assigning particular signs to locations, like Cancer ruled Amsterdam and Aries to Palestine and England. Some also tried a creation and foundation charts for places to do a kind of synastry, like looking at the chart New York, which has a Capricorn sun. I don't remember the rising right now, but kind of look at your chart and see how New York might situate with you. The problem with that, I'll just say this very quickly, is that some places like New Orleans may have multiple charts in terms of their founding. So which one are you going to use for your chart? Now, in the 20th century, we developed greater levels of sophistication and personalization for how to match this with a natal chart. So relocating a chart is to relocate a chart to a different location corresponding to the exact time of birth in that location. So for instance, if you were born at 1:20 in New York on a certain date, then if we wanted to relocate you to California, we would just go 3 hours before that. So it would be at that same particular time in the world, but 3 hours before. And so that would be, I believe, 10:20 as an example. ACG is, as I mentioned earlier, is a method developed by Jim Lewis and works by determining where on Earth various astrological energies or planets were angular, meaning at the midheaven or the IC, at the descendant or ascendant, and correspondingly seeing where they can join at various points of latitude. There's also another kind of chart which you can do on Astro-Seek and also on astro.com. A local space chart is a horizon-based system rather than centered on the ecliptic, which is the nature astrocartography. Local space astrology is more directional. ACG is more locational, more like located in terms of that. And what this, I'm going to show you an illustration of that in a second. The geodetic chart is a static projection of the signs and basically figuring out where you fit or where your chart fits based on those places on Earth. Let me show you the difference. So this is actually using a local space chart, or it's better said as a local space map. So this is a projection of my chart of, and you'll notice it'll look different from ACG. And by the way, this is an example of ACG where you might have, you might have seen those lines, the straight lines representing along the midheaven IC axis, and the curvy lines representing the ascendant-descendant axis. Whereas this is just, like I said, horizontal. You're like, okay, what do I use this for? It could be more so figuring out how these lines might relate to parts of the globe. Again, more additional information and testimony. But what I really like is that you can even get more specific and start looking at this almost like your personalized, customized feng shui. Because you actually could do this even with a lot more specificity related to your city. Now, what I wanted to show you is that you can see my Jupiter descendant line goes all the way over toward the Hawaiian Islands. Like, okay, well, what's funny for me is that my ex-wife came from there. And when I say ex, former wife, doesn't mean anything bad. Like, I'm not gonna make some bad joke about her. I think we have a great relationship. It's just more so just to give you a context that it emphasizes, you know, where my partner, because she was from Hawaii, where she came from. So this might give you a clue, especially if you use astrocartography, on where you might, you know, not just look for a partner or kind of recognize where certain people may show up in your life a certain way. This is an example of the geodetic map, and what I mean by static is that because Greenwich is the orientation of the place, I have to do it with my eyes up like this because it annoys me, but Greenwich is the orientation of time as we understand it on our planet. So that gets 0 Aries, even though it goes all the way through Accra, Ghana, but we won't get into that. And then we can go and see that Seattle, for instance, gets a midheaven of 0 Sag. So you can see how that is close. You're like, okay, so what does that mean? Well, and then you can see that 0 Aquarius crosses over that way too. The geodetic chart, we could describe more how a place receives you. Whereas astrocartography would be more how you receive a place. Just to make sure that distinction, it's like, I like New York, right? But does New York like you? Right? Right? And Colin said, no, hurt my feelings. That's fine. Mundane, Catholic, world astrology, like Catholic. One of the funny things about that word, it means universal. And this is what Ptolemy called this form of astrology. And it's considered the oldest branch of astrology, and it was used more for the condition of royalty and leaders and the country and kingdom in more ancient time. Again, like I said, he called it Catholic Ptolemy, but Ali Alomi has coined another phrase, which is more world astrology, even though mundus also does mean world. Mundane astrology evaluates the astrological conditions that affect the government, its leaders, and the populace at national, state, and city or municipal levels. Through the centuries, various methods have been used to prognosticate, you know, what constitutes as mundane astrology, Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions, the equinox and solstice ingress, foundation charts, charts for leaders, eclipse charts, comets, and fixed stars. Again, this was believed that studying mundane astrology was to be studied before natal charts because individuals are more subsumed or belonging to something larger than themselves. Hence, I write, the charts for a disaster can't necessarily be examined by studying the individual charts of all those involved or affected. What that means is, to break that down, there was a question someone asked me once. Do you think all the people who died in the Twin Towers on 9/11 just had fucked up charts or bad days? And the answer is no, but they were in a building that did. So, you know, they were subsumed over by something larger than themselves. So that's important to remember related to mundane. There's meteorological astrology or astrometeorology. Astrologers were among the first meteorologists, using astrology and observance of the sky to predict changes in the weather. In Tetrabiblos, Ptolemy set the initial standard for how astrologers would discuss weather prediction by some of his ideas and notions. Same thing for Islamicate astrologers. Medieval astrologers like Johannes Kepler introduced Europe to the idea of the almanac for annual and eventual daily and monthly weather prognostications. They became immensely popular. I mean, still you can get a farmer's almanac, but pretty much they were, what everyone relied on. By the 19th century, the popular prevalence of almanacs died down due to advances in technology and the skepticism of the age of reason, industrialization. Fortunately, meteorological astrology has kind of resurfaced thanks to, you can find a book by Chris Brandt Risky that breaks down some astrometeorology and some principles that you can use in order to kind of figure out, whether you're heading more toward, more flooding in your area or other things like that. Financial and business astrology has also become quite a thing. Financial astrology focuses on the study of movement of financial markets. There is a distinction though, and I'm quoting the astrology book here by James R. Lewis. Business astrology focuses on the day-to-day workings of an individual company and its leaders. We might say that business astrology belongs under the general umbrella of that branch of financial astrology. Many financial astrologers believe their branch was more developed in the 20th century, but there's abundant evidence that Islamicate astrologers, for example, use various techniques to track business ventures as well. Many astrologers have produced techniques and practices for forecasting markets and businesses. You might look into the work of W.D. Gann. Often these astrologers would use various techniques, including planetary nodal cycles, not just the moon, but looking at Jupiter's nodes. Because every planet, maybe you know this, some of you don't, is that every planet has nodes just like the moon. And so you can use those related to business principles. Some of the notable astrologers for this are Ray Merriman, Olga Morales, Grace Morris, Georgia Stathis, Bill Meridian, our own here, Stormy Grace, and Michael McCasey. All right, we're going toward the stretch, the final part. Understanding technique, method, approach in astrology. The how. So what I want to say here, what this particular part of the talk is dedicated to, as distinct from a school, and then as distinct from a branch, is where we start looking at how we do particular things. Now, I would be open to robust debate about this, but I would say predictive astrology is more about techniques. I do not think it is a branch of astrology. Again, that's my take on it. And the reason why, it's definitely not a school of thought, because every school of thought that I've introduced you to has some form of predictive astrology. One of the things that's funny, and this is where I am going to cast shade toward evolutionary astrologers, including Stephen Forrest, but he and I have had this conversation before, so it's okay. Is where he might say like, well, evolutionary astrology does not do predictive astrology, right? Like when you look at a goddamn natal chart and you say like, well, this person is going to be this kind of person, you are making a prediction, right? So this is why I kind of accepts some measure of it, but he looks at predictive differently. I think there are a vast number of predictive techniques you can use within specific branches. So you can use natal, horary, financial. So for instance, for horary, you can make a prediction about something in someone just from the horary. Not just like, will I find love? A horary astrologer or particularly a horary chart, depending on the chart, could reveal even when. So that's what I mean by predictive. It is most distinguished by technique and approach, in my opinion, rather than by a school or even by a branch. There's experiential astrology. I won't read this whole quote, but I do like some part of it where it emphasizes, and she says, this is from Barbara Shermer, who wrote a book on experiential astrology. Experiential astrology seeks to remedies this dry sensibility by putting us back in direct contact with our horoscopes, with means such as images, metaphor, story, myth, ritual, thank you, music, and dramatic artistic expression. This includes a broad range of approaches from our own Jason Holly here, who's going to have a conference. I don't work for the man either, but he is going to have a conference in Santa Fe, New Mexico, dealing with experiential astrology in October. You can contact him more about that. Gary Caton is another good example of this. So is our own Gemini Brett, experiencing the sky, Ariel Goodman, and shamanic astrologer Daniel Giamaro. You didn't mention shamanic astrology. Well, we could put it under New Age in that sense. Now, the other thing I'll mention and say, and then I'll have room for questions in just a minute. This is going back full circle. I think as a matter of, or questions of method and technique to explore is where you say, I use a particular zodiac. So I have seen on Twitter and on social media, sidereal astrologers say, well, I practice sidereal astrology. And I'm just like, chick, you just use a sidereal zodiac. There isn't an actual astrology that is completely distinct from all the astrologies that I've mentioned. The same thing, well, I'm a whole sign astrologer. You just do your charts in whole sign. That doesn't make you a whole sign astrologer any more than if I said, I'm a Placidus astrologer, right? It's just another aspect of technique. So again, it's more how you might approach it. That doesn't illustrate your school of thought. It illustrate even the branch you're using. Which planets points do you use? You could be more into hypotheticals. You could be more into asteroids. You could be more into trans-Neptunians. Again, that doesn't mean like, well, I'm a Sedna astrologer. You are just working with Sedna. And then again, this is not known as much. You can be geocentric or heliocentric. And so there's another way in which you can look at whether you're looking at things from a heliocentric point of view or a geocentric point of view, but that can also fit to any other particular form or school. So in summary, I just want to say that astrology is a vast discipline, and I just mentioned that you could better call it astrologies. However, it's possible to make distinctions. Schools usually constitute an overarching set of principles, philosophies, and history that's separate from other astrologies, even during the same historical period. Because there's some overlap, for instance, between Islamicate and medieval. They are also broadly generalized as there could be subdivisions within the school or style, and we could call that a style as well. Many present-day astrologers have so branded themselves a certain way, such as sidereal astrologer, as a mean of distinction from other astrologers, but this is more so by technique or method than school of thought, or it could just be branding. When confused, and someone may come out with a new form of astrology, they could say like, I'm a human design astrologer, right? Ask yourself, or ask the astrologer, better yet, who or what influences them? Because they come from a school of thought, unless they're like, no, I just downloaded this. I woke up like this. Okay. And you'll have a better sense of whether they are distinguishing themselves by school, branch, or technique. So this was just to get the conversation started. Again, dealing with the confusion that some students, whether they are new or they're seasoned, may not know or even be thinking about the distinction between a school, a branch, and a method. Thank you, and I'm ready for questions. So, do I have any questions? Yeah, talk to me.
It seems that humanistic astrology is really influential in contemporary astro discourses, even though I've rarely seen it directly referenced. Why do you think that is?
I think, so the question was, can they hear you too or no? Okay, the Zoom folks can hear you too.
Could you repeat it?
Yeah, so humanistic astrology, say it again, so I don't paraphrase.
Yeah, humanistic astrology is really influential in contemporary discourse.
Okay, it's influential in contemporary discourse, but it's rarely referenced because it's become like water and we're like fish. And one of the reasons why I wanted to make these distinctions and emphasize the history is that we take things as a normal, thank you for the time. We take things as a normal without recognizing that they have a lineage and a history and they just become like, that's just the way it is. And again, to be fair, there's a way in which we've had a certain collapse between humanistic and psychological. Some don't see it as any distinction. One of the interesting things about the surfacing of Hellenistic or traditional Islamic astrology, I think it's complicated the conversation some, so that people are aware. So for instance, 10 years ago, when I first came to Norway, you didn't have as many traditional astrologers, and you didn't have anyone talking about magic. I was just talking with my girlfriend today, she just takes magic as, people are like, well, yeah, hasn't everyone ever done talismans? No, in fact, or even tarot. A lot of astrologers used to poo-poo on tarot. Like when, I won't get into names, but when we had our last UAC, literally people did not want any tarot readers in the marketplace because they felt like, well, that's gonna diminish the glory of astrology. So, yeah, that's kind of, there's just been some changes. What other questions do we have, including from our audience here? Yes,
I remember like, as far as like not the astrology, but the directional,
Mhm.
horizon directional, Robert Hand, in a completely separate talk, he said he thought that they didn't have any influence beyond like 100 miles from the birthplace, but you just said that you met your wife, that was, Honolulu or Hawaii.
yeah, that was in New York.
Yeah, so that was much more than 100 miles.
Okay, way more. I think, yeah, I think the local, so there's a difference between the local space map, which is what I showed for Honolulu, and then a local space chart. And the local space chart may in fact only have a limited influence of 100 miles. The map is the map, so it's gonna be the map on the globe, so it can be farther. So the question was, that Robert Hand in a lecture once said that local space didn't have any influence beyond 100 miles, but it seems clear, as I mentioned with my example, that since I met my wife from New York all the way in Honolulu, or we connected, that kind of negates that. But I can, I'm gonna defer to the Hand and imagine that he was thinking more about the chart rather than the map. We have time for one more question. Either from the Zoom or Avram, yes.
Why do you not subscribe to the concept of reincarnation?
Oh my God, why are you gonna put me in?
It's not a loaded question.
It's not a loaded question. But it's like, oh, I just wanted to stick to the lecture. A couple reasons. We are in our lifetime. Now, if you want to go with the Judeo-Christian idea of a soul, and that you have this unique composition of yourself as a soul that needs to transport itself from life to life, makes some measure of sense. But whatever you call yourself, your sense of identity, is been largely crafted by the unique composition and compiling of your genes matched with your given circumstances, your precognitive or your cognitive development, your prefrontal cortex development. All these things are the assemblage of who you are. So this idea that you're going to be carrying it into your next life as you, right, as yourself, and that there's some essence that is completely distinct from any other human being, then I think that is kind of really a stretch. The other reason is, show me in nature what kind of composes the nature of reincarnation. I can look at a tree that dies in the winter or in the fall, and it won't even sprout a leaf at the same position. So why does it need to reincarnate you? So that's, it's kind of more of an ego investment, I think, that we all keep in order to kind of perpetuate some sense of ourselves. I think we return to the source, and what incarnates is the source. And you might say, like, well, what about my memories? I think the memories that we often have in the quote unquote reincarnation experience are absolutely true. But that doesn't make them yours.
So maybe we're looking at it too literally.
Yeah, exactly. That's my take. But you asked.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you.